Well, good afternoon, everyone. We are ready to start our first of two webinars this spring as follow-up conversations around the essential instructional practices in literacy for 4th and 5th grade. Many of you were able to participate in a full day of learning and have an overview of these practices for 4th and 5th grade in literacy, but also have the opportunity to engage in conversations with your colleagues. And it was just that, an overview. It was one day and a lot of content, and we were able to hear from some exceptional researchers in these grade levels around literacy and literacy development. Now we're stepping into some application work together. And again, this is still the first steps to that work as we engage around this document at a state level. A lot of things are happening in local ways. But today is the first opportunity to hear some examples that really integrate across essentials and help us envision ways that we might enhance things and learn together. So in a webinar, it is probably as valuable as you make it. So we are going to have some engagement opportunities, and please do take those engagement opportunities up. Do give us some information in the chat, brainstorm with each other, give each other feedback on your ideas, and do please feel free to pose explicit questions in the Q&A section so that we're able to address those as time allows. So my name is Erin Brown. I'm the Professional Learning Coordinator for Michigan Association of Intermediate School Administrators. We serve the Early Literacy Task Force, and the Early Literacy Task Force includes Michigan Department of Education, specifically Laurel Treble and Lisa Brown, Early Literacy Coaching Consultants at MDE, are integral to this work and have helped plan with Dr. Anne-Marie Palanzar and Dr. Miranda Fitzgerald and I around this work. And we're just excited to serve the conversations around the literacy work in 4th and 5th grade, and hopefully continue to hear from you about what's most needed and create opportunities for this kind of collaboration. So thank you everyone for saying hi in the chat. I am going to turn this over to Dr. Palanzar and Dr. Fitzgerald.
Hi, thank you everybody for joining us today for our first of two, like Erin said, follow-up webinars to really dive deeper into some of the essential practices in literacy for grades 4 and 5. This session today is really designed to build on our time together in our February session. And based on your questions and feedback from February, today we're going to dig into a theme that really cuts across multiple essential practices. That theme really focuses on supporting students to discuss ideas and texts across texts and disciplines, such as in literature and history and in science, and particularly with a focus on supporting this kind of discussion about text when students are working together in small groups. So we want to launch today by quickly noting that this webinar is based on the essential practices for grades 4-5 document, and that the content we share today is really meant to complement and not replace the document itself. The practice that we want to foreground today is essential number 5, discussion of the ideas in texts and how to construct text meaning across texts and disciplines. Here we highlight bullet 2 that you see boxed in orange, focused on carefully selecting texts that provides the grist for rich discussion, because productive discussion of ideas in a text really hinges on whether the text includes ideas or features that are worthy of discussing. And we'll say more about that in just a bit. At the same time, we really want to hone in on bullet 4, which calls for providing tasks or routines that students know how to follow when discussing their texts in small groups. In addition to this, we want to highlight the ways in which Essential 5 overlaps with Essentials number 2 and Essential number 3. For example, Essential 2 calls for intentional instruction with increasingly complex texts and tasks that build comprehension, knowledge, and strategic reading. Here we want to point out the first bullet in this essential, which again calls for the teacher to facilitate discussion of text meaning to support students to interpret the ideas in text. This is relevant to both whole class discussion and small group discussion, because even when students are leading the discussion and playing the most active roles, the teacher still has an important facilitative role to play. We also want to highlight essential number 3, focused on supporting small group instruction explicitly and especially bullet 2, which again calls for the teacher to provide opportunities and support students to engage in small group discussions of both literature or narrative text, as well as other disciplinary texts, such as historical or scientific texts, so that students can really benefit from one another's knowledge and experiences and work to co-construct text meaning with their peers. So when we look across these three essentials, we think that there are three big themes or takeaways for thinking about how to plan and how to really support students to read and discuss texts in small groups. The first is the importance of really carefully selecting the text that students will discuss, which we pointed to just a bit earlier. The second is providing clear tasks, discussion protocols, or routines that students know how to follow. And finally, emphasizing the importance of supporting students to read strategically and build knowledge in small group discussions and when sharing across groups. So we hope that this slide really illustrates the ways in which the essential practices were designed to overlap in really intentional ways. As we dive in today, I want to note that some of the ideas and practices in today's webinar are based on the What Works Clearinghouse Practice Guide, Improving Adolescent Literacy. And we also referenced this in February if you were with us during that time. This practice guide is available on the IES website and provides recommendations for classroom instruction based on a large synthesis of research studies across grades 4 through 12. So as we continue, we're going to continue to unpack some of these ideas. We're going to view some excerpts of classroom video like Erin described earlier, and to see some rich illustrations of practice, and then we'll pause and share and try to respond to some of the questions that you might have. Then we're going to continue to unpack some of these practices, view a second video clip, and field a few more questions before we close today. To begin unpacking the elements of these practices, we really cannot emphasize enough the importance of selecting texts that provide that grist for rich discussion, and really provide a compelling and engaging reason for students to talk together about the ideas in text. So what are features of text that provide the grist for rich discussion? Look for complex texts that are engaging for students and that students are interested in reading, that describes situations, content, or themes that can stimulate rich conversations among students. Look for texts that contain issues or content that might be particularly challenging or easily misunderstood. Examples can include science or historical texts, such as scientific reports or primary sources. Also look for texts that contain sections that might be ambiguous or subject to multiple interpretations, as well as texts that contain thematically related content. So think about text sets here that allow for critical analysis and also might include some controversy that can be used as a stimulus for extended discussions, not just across one text, but across multiple texts over time. And finally, look for texts that provide opportunities for students to engage in rich disciplinary inquiry. Again, thinking about an example might be looking at multiple primary source texts in history to construct a historical argument. The research literature supports a family of approaches to small group discussion, and some of these examples are identified in the Essential Practices document itself, so we wanted to share a little bit more information about these with you today. We share some examples today, not to recommend one particular approach over another, but to really illustrate the different types of thinking that these approaches support. The research literature describes a few different stances toward discussing text, and these include an efferent stance, a critical analytic stance, and an expressive stance. An efferent stance really foregrounds knowledge building with text. These discussions emphasize text-focused responses that prioritize identifying and using particular information from text. One example of a framework that supports an efferent stance is instructional conversations, which is a program of research conducted by Goldenberg and other colleagues. Instructional conversations is a small group discussion framework to help students understand texts, complex concepts, and multiple perspectives. Research findings from this program of research indicate that instructional conversations are particularly effective for supporting struggling readers' comprehension, as well as English learners. In instructional conversations, the teacher selects a complex theme from a text and develops a discussion plan to support small groups' discussion of text. When we think about critical analytic stance, this stance prioritizes interrogating the text to identify arguments, worldviews, assumptions, or beliefs. This stance encourages discussion in which the reader asks questions and critically responds to the text, so really emphasizing a critical response here. And if you were with us in February, we unpacked a little bit of the research about collaborative reasoning at that time. But just to recap, collaborative reasoning is a discussion framework that's designed to engage students in critical reading and thinking. Students read a text that raises a big question about an issue, that invites multiple perspectives or competing ideas that can be supported by evidence in the text. After reading, students gather in small groups to discuss these big questions by taking a position, supporting their positions, providing counter arguments, and responding to challenges from their peers. A final example is the expressive stance, and this stance really emphasizes a reader-focused response. Discussions in this stance focus on the reader's affective response and connection to the text. And one example of a framework that focuses on an expressive stance is literature circles. When we think about literature circles, one of the main goals of literature circles is to support engaged and sustained reading and to support students' interpretation, prediction, analysis, and comprehension. To prepare for discussion, in literature circles, students often assume particular roles that are probably familiar to you, such as discussion director or connector or summarizer. A really important point that we want to make about these roles is that it's so important to keep in mind that roles are designed to be scaffolds. This means that they should be faded out over time as students learn to more skillfully manage small group discussions independently so that they're able to have more authentic and generative discussions. We also want to point you to an article by Leitner and Wilkinson published in the Reading Teacher that digs more deeply into these and other research-based approaches for supporting quality talk about text. And we think that this is a great resource that will help you just provide more information about each of these different frameworks that you can think about the pros and cons in particular contexts. At this point, we want to dive into illustrations of what it actually looks like to manage, models, and support small group discussions in 4th and 5th grade classrooms. To start building toward this complex practice with students, it's a great idea to really start short and build stamina with more practice. Depending on the classroom context, this could be as simple and as short as a 30-second turn and talk, where you provide a rich question and students turn and talk with a partner, and then gradually build to more complex and more extended discussions. Model higher order questions and responses so that students know what this looks like and how they might respond. Provide sample question or sentence starters so that students know how to respond to these types of questions and the kinds of connective tissue that really hold a discussion together. You could provide a chart with discussion expectations or guidelines so that students can self-monitor as they engage in small group discussions. Another example is have students prepare for the discussion ahead of time. And we're going to share some different types of protocols and approaches to doing this in just a few minutes. And this is a really powerful way to support students to really have something meaningful to talk about by the time they're working together with their group. And then finally, use discussion guides, protocols, and routines that students learn over time and then build competence with and know how to follow. And so these supports, we think, can serve as training wheels while students strengthen their ability to engage in small group peer-led discussions. So while students are learning to do this work, we also want to point out it's especially important for the teacher to really actively be circulating and assisting individual small groups as needed. To offer an illustration of many of these practices, we want to share a video of students in a 5th grade class using a jigsaw protocol and small group discussion to deepen their understanding of the novel Esperanza Rising and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We share this clip not to illustrate the particular curriculum materials being used, but to look really closely at the teacher's practices. As we view the video, think about the question you see on your screen, and we want to invite you to jot some notes personally or to add some notes in response to this question to the chat box. What do you notice about how the teacher supports students to have productive small group discussions in this classroom? And we want to share with you just a quick note about sometimes the trickiness of using video in these kinds of situations. We've tested this many times and we're really hopeful that it's going to go smoothly, but just be mindful that it's possible that you may see a little bit of a disconnect between the audio and the speed of the video.
What was the chapter mostly about, and also to make a connection to the chapter title. Fahmi?
In this chapter, Esperanza found Marta and helped her out and told her to carry the asparagus and put on an apron so she'll look like a worker.
Why would Marta need help?
Because Marta was striking.
Marta was striking. Interesting. What does that mean?
They don't pay you enough, so you're fighting for more money.
Their rights, their human rights that we've been learning so much about really aren't being fulfilled. How our unit started off is we studied the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone has the right to work. We're moving on with that knowledge to Esperanza Rising, asking them to connect the ideas from literature to the lessons that we learned from human rights. Think about what we just read. Think about the chapter. How are those things connecting for us?
Some of the workers stayed to work because even though they weren't getting paid enough money, they were still grateful for what they had.
Which kind of ties back into our learning targets. We reviewed our learning targets, and the second learning target was about inferencing.
I can make inferences from the text about the characters in Esperanza Rising.
So today what we're going to do is we're going to get into our triads, and we're going to choose one character that we're interested in going a little bit deeper with. I then ask the students to transition into their triads. Once they were in their triads, I asked them to choose one character to focus on, either Marta, Miguel, or Esperanza.
Well, I would choose Esperanza because she has a lot of details.
Now that you've decided who you are going to be, we're going to be doing a jigsaw activity. So many times throughout the year, we use a jigsaw protocol, which is where the students break off into different groups and they become responsible for learning a small piece of text, bringing it back to their original triad and becoming the expert on that text. I want to make sure that I answer the questions with evidence and then I'm able to share that with the other people in my group. So we're going to ask you to move to your characters table. So now that you're at your character table, I want you to find the page that matches the character you selected. There were 3 text-dependent questions for each character. You are going to be looking in the text for evidence to support your answers to these questions. When you find evidence or details that you could use in your answer, I want you to use one of the evidence flags that's placed around the table to mark exactly that spot. So what I want you to do right now is we're going to have a group discussion about the answers, the evidence, and the details that you found from the text. You want to make sure that you're really being an active listener. You are building off of their ideas. And if you needed help, what posters or charts do you think might be able to help you when you're having your group discussions?
Textual evidence.
Sure. So you want to tell your friends, well, on page 100, it said, and we
Bear with us for just a minute.
I think if I could just interject while Miranda does that troubleshooting, we're looking forward to getting a sense of what you noticed in this video. One of the observations that I would make is that it's so clear that this is a classroom in which they have a tradition. This is a norm. This is something that this classroom as a community has been accustomed to doing. And we were, as Miranda and I were talking in preparation for today, we were talking about the importance of that community, that if you are in a school where the children have a tradition of being in discussion groups, then the teacher has much more to depend upon and doesn't have to do as much foundational work. But if your children don't have a history of being accountable in small group talk, then of course the teacher has to build that culture of conversation at the same time that they're teaching children the strategies for making sense of text and giving them different prompts and support. So that's one observation that we made. Another one that we made is that I've heard teachers express some frustration that they still need to be present in those discussions, or that they need to really monitor closely what's happening. And we think that that's probably not a bad thing at all. These are still young children. And also, as you change the nature of the task or the demands of the text, you can expect that you're going to have to take more of a role in helping to facilitate the discussion. So those were some additional observations we made.
And so, like Anne-Marie was talking about, what we kind of wanted to do about that video is, I know you missed the last few minutes of it, but we kind of want to highlight some of the practices that we think are so important to the video and that I think will be really salient to you when you watch it separately on your own. And those include that the teacher selected texts that could stimulate rich conversation, multiple interpretations, and synthesis. She supported students to prepare for the discussion ahead of time. I think you saw the part where the students were marking text evidence in their novel with sticky notes. A little bit later in this video excerpt, students complete a graphic organizer to support them to have their discussion together in a class that's really focused on the particular topic and the ideas that the teacher wants the students to be discussing and thinking about in their small groups. The teacher posed higher order, open-ended questions that invited students to share and give reasons for diverse perspectives. And I know that you didn't see this part, but some of those questions included, would you strike or would you continue to work? Why? And now I want to see the other side of the opinion. Who would continue to be a worker? And inviting students to share and compare their ideas about these questions. She also used that protocol that students knew how to use. She said they introduced the Jigsaw protocol early in the year to support students to gather their ideas and make responses to text and become an expert about a particular portion or part of a text. And then they get in their small groups to share and brainstorm ideas together. And finally, she pointed to those sample question stems and sentence starters that the students were familiar with. I think the chart that she had up was text evidence. And what are some sentence starters or question starters that we can use within our discussion to think about where our evidence is coming from in a text. I think the one that the student pointed out was, on page blank it says. So that's a good example of a sentence starter that a student could use to say, well, this is where I found my evidence. This is where I marked with my sticky note, to support them to have something to share. And so at this point, I know that we've already asked some questions and Anne-Marie responded to just a couple of things, but if there are other questions that have been raised, we're happy to take some time or give you some time to respond. Or we can continue moving on and field just more questions at the end as they come up.
Sure. We recall that in February, there were some questions about the research base for each of these, the three methods that Miranda shared with you. So literature circles, collaborative reasoning, and the talk, how she refers it, Goldenberg's
Instructional
conversations, right. And so we just want to assure you that we did take a look, and we're happy to send a connection to some of the evidence that speaks to the value of each one of those approaches. And they've been studied in terms of like the quality of the conversations. They've also been studied in terms of the outcomes for comprehension. So each one of those approaches has merit and support in the literature.
And there's a question about that right now. Anne Marie, were you addressing that when you were?
No, I didn't see a question about that.
Oh, well, it's timely because there's a question here from Melissa wondering about the stance on the lit circle roles and the writing circles and things. And so, Miranda, you mentioned that earlier in the conversation about being a scaffold, that if we need them, then we release that. Would you like to speak any more about that and where that is referenced in the research?
Sure. So as far as, I'll speak more to the lit circle roles because I'm not as familiar with writing circles, and so I'd have to do a little more, I'd have to do some digging for some literature about that specifically. But pretty consistently in the writing about literature circles, including in Harvey Daniels' books, who has written a lot about literature circles and applications for classroom practice, is this idea that when we think about roles, they can serve as, like I said, really helpful training wheels for helping students know how to come to a text and also what they can bring and what they can contribute to a particular small group discussion. And so starting with a particular role can help students enter into a discussion and learn a little bit about taking turns and sharing. And so sharing my summary of the text perhaps, and then inviting other members of the group to add on to my summary of the text or to add additional parts to a summary or an alternative summary of the text. And so I think that when we provide some caveats about those roles, the important thing is that we don't get really tied to the roles. And so it's not that we're going to learn these and use literature circles, and so we're going to use these roles, here they are on the wall, and we're going to use them all year, right? But thinking about, well, how can these get us started in having small group discussions, but then how can we fade these roles out and move toward more generative, more authentic kinds of discussions that are more fluid and where students are really listening carefully to each other's ideas and responding to one another's ideas. Do you want to add anything to that, Anne-Marie?
I guess I would just add, I think that's really helpful. I would just add that if we're mindful of why the roles are helpful to making sense of the literature, that it's more than just everyone has to have a reasonable way to participate. But for example, if you're the illustrator, you're supporting your student to have help bringing the group's attention to what role are graphics playing in this particular story, this particular photograph, for example, in an historical text. Or if you're the time traveler or you're the journey tracer, why is that important? Why is it important to have someone who's tracing the journey of the characters in this particular text? So just, as you're suggesting, it's not the case that you were trying to, it's just like strategies. It's not about being able to assume this role well. What it means to assume the role well is that it's really helping to advance everybody's understanding of the ideas in the text. So maybe that can be helpful to us in getting a sense of whether these roles are working or not. Is it that the students are just kind of falling into these kind of algorithmic ways of, I'm taking my role, now I'm going to summarize, and now we're going to move on to the questioner? Or is it that by virtue of having someone who's leading a summary and other children are adding on, or a student who's generating questions and other students are really responding, that it's advancing the student's understanding of the ideas in the text? So I don't know, Melissa, if that's helpful. Please respond to us. Let us know if that's a helpful distinction. Or if you have additional questions, because this is one that we heard in February as well.
And just to connect to the latest comment in the chat, as well as the video that we viewed and didn't get to see the whole piece, but the entire video will be available. I wonder if the actual role that it isn't as important as helping students see themselves.
Given the time, should we move on?
We'll move on for now, and then we'll come back to additional questions. So kind of building on what the parts of the video that you saw and some that you will soon see, at this point, we wanted to look, now that we've looked at the video excerpt that illustrated some of those practices, we want to share a few more examples of the kinds of resources that teachers can use to structure and facilitate small group discussions in 4th and 5th grade classrooms. And I think that these examples will be helpful to continue thinking about some of the questions that we've just been talking about. So one example resource is providing a chart that teachers can share with students to remind students of participation expectations in order to set goals before beginning a small group discussion, to reference during discussions to help groups redirect if the discussion goes off track, and to revisit after discussions to reflect on how well groups followed the guidelines and set new goals for next time. So the example guidelines that you see on the screen target ideas like staying on topic, respecting other people's beliefs and viewpoints through not interrupting or arguing during the discussion, making an effort to look at both sides of the issue, both for and against a particular issue, and giving all members of the group opportunities to participate and to share. And I think what's really important about this is not necessarily these specific 4 guidelines, but the idea that teachers and students can also come up with participation guidelines as a class and revise them or add to the guidelines as needed throughout the year. And really unpacking when we say something like, make an effort to look at both sides of an issue, what does that mean? And what kinds of things do we say when we're trying to do that in the context of a discussion? So being really explicit and supporting students to how can we set goals for the discussion? How can we monitor our discussion on our own to know how effective it's being? And then how can we reflect on our discussion and set goals for how productive we've been and how we can perhaps be more productive the next time? Another support that you saw in the video clip is providing sample question stems and conversation moves that students can reference and practice during small group discussions. For example, the orange speech bubble gives examples of words and phrases that people say when they need someone to elaborate, such as, can you say more about that? And what do you mean by? Then in the red speech bubble, it gives examples of words and phrases that people say when they are elaborating for someone, such as, sure, let me be more clear, or it's like when, and then continues with a response that's specific to the text that they're reading. These kinds of question stems and response stems can help students learn to practice that connective tissue that makes discussions flow well and really helps students truly listen to their peers' ideas, to ask clarifying questions to deepen their own understanding, and to provide reasoning or examples to clarify their thinking or others' thinking. Then the second set on the screen provides sample conversation moves that help students share multiple interpretations or opinions, to make connections to others' ideas, to share confusions and wonderings, and to build on other ideas. In addition to providing participation guidelines or question or sentence stems to scaffold small group discussions, supporting students to prepare for discussions ahead of time is really key to supporting them to have productive small group discussions, especially in the elementary grades, right? That really supports students to comprehend complex texts and to develop and share evidence-based arguments about texts. So on your screen, what you see is just a generic jigsaw protocol. This is one example of a kind of resource that can support students to prepare ahead of time, but really the important thing is that these can take any form, and they can look quite different based on the affordances of the text that students read, the learning goals that the teacher has set, and the particular focus of the discussion. And I think Erin pointed to this earlier when we were responding to the question about literature circles and thinking about what different resources we choose, what roles those play in best serving our purposes for a particular discussion. So really the important takeaway here is that these types of resources can take on many different forms, and that the most useful examples are going to be tailored to the particular text and the task that the teacher wants students to discuss. Before we dive into, or at least set up and frame another video clip for you that illustrates some of these practices, we want to make a few points about the teacher's really important role in small group discussions. So even when students are taking charge of the discussion, the teacher has an incredibly important role to play, which centers on actively circulating among groups first and foremost. But while circulating, there are a lot of different ways that the teacher can support students to have productive discussions. One of those ways is by redirecting discussions that go off track, We know that this is absolutely going to happen in 4th and 5th grade classrooms, especially as students are learning how to have these kinds of rich discussions about text. The teacher can also model reading comprehension strategies and reasoning processes by thinking aloud. So while they're circulating, popping into different students' discussions and really supporting them to try on different thinking practices and strategies. The teacher can pose questions to prompt additional discussion or follow-up questions to really probe and extend students' thinking or reasoning, as well as introducing counter-arguments or points of view, especially when students are having a discussion about multiple different ideas or competing ideas. Sometimes these counter-arguments can be really difficult to formulate, and so students may need the teacher's support in learning how to do this work. Finally, the teacher may summarize the flow of ideas in a discussion. So after small groups have had the time to discuss and they've come back and shared out with the class, a really important role of the teacher is really synthesizing ideas from across groups and really supporting students to kind of capture this is the ground that we've covered today. And we've talked about these really important ideas and we've come to this outcome. Or we've realized that we still have really different opinions, and that's going to help us move forward. And finally, recognizing good reasoning when it's introduced. Do you want to add something, Anne-Marie?
I just wanted to say one thing that occurs. There's an interesting literature about the role of the teacher when she or he is circulating among groups, and it's a difficult trade-off because the teacher does have to hang back long enough to really get an understanding of the flow of the discussion that Miranda is referring to. So Kathleen Hogan did a study in which she saw ways in which teachers with the very best of intentions were interrupting, not recognizing that in fact what the teacher perceived as an off-track discussion, if you went back and looked at the transcript, it was actually a productive discussion. So what Kathleen Hogan saw are that if the teacher prematurely interrupts the discussion, it can lead to students being more dependent upon the teacher. They just stop talking when the teacher shows up, or the teacher may not be aware that in fact, because of the history of that discussion, that in fact it was more productive than the teacher realized at that moment. So it's tough because we only have so much time, but it's interesting that even that activity of circulating among groups can be much more complex than it would seem on its face. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you. And so instead of actually watching this video clip, because I fear that we'll have the same kind of technical meltdown that we did earlier, I just want to give you a brief synopsis so that you kind of have the framing for when you have a chance to go and look at this video later. And so what this video foregrounds is a 5th grade classroom in which students are analyzing a set of primary sources in the context of history lessons about American slavery. And this really culminates, this is a several-day lesson that you see snippets of, and it really culminates in the students participating in a Socratic seminar to deepen their interpretations. And so what you would see in the video is the teacher selecting a series of primary source texts to support students to really analyze a variety of different perspectives, focused on a unit that students are learning about American slavery, and then the ways in which she really strategically scaffolds students' interpretation of the individual texts, as well as their interpretation and discussion across texts. And then once they're in the Socratic seminar, they're really thoughtfully discussing the ways in which these different perspectives are in interplay and how students are interpreting those different perspectives and providing rich evidence from the primary sources that they've analyzed. And so I do want to highlight for you just some of the things. This will be a little bit of a recap of some of the synopsis that I just gave you, but some of the really important work that this teacher does in that video is she selected text to stimulate really rich conversation, multiple interpretations, and to engage students in disciplinary, in this case, historical inquiry. She really carefully sequenced the texts to scaffold students' interpretation of individual texts and their interpretation across texts. She supported students to prepare for the discussion ahead of time using a series of graphic organizers. and a gallery walk. She also posed those higher order open-ended questions that invited diverse perspectives from students. Some of these examples were, how do you think slave owners viewed themselves based on the sources we've reviewed? And can you tell me what you think Frederick Douglass's perspective would be on this book? She supported students also to generate their own questions about the texts that they read, including in the primary source set, this included books, this included, I think, speeches, and also included images that students analyzed. She also engaged students in setting goals for the discussion and asked them, make some individual goals. What do you want to do in this discussion today? How do you want to show up for this class discussion? And then she used a discussion routine again that students knew how to follow and were familiar with. Finally, she posed follow-up questions to really probe and extend students' thinking and reasoning. While students were kind of self-monitoring in the context of the Socratic seminar, the teacher was listening really carefully to identify places where she could really extend students' reasoning, press for additional evidence, and pose some follow-up questions. And then from there, I think we have time for more questions. If you have questions about this particular topic, the ideas that we've talked about today, or other questions. I saw somebody had a question that they pointed out wasn't quite related to this, but we can probably address that too. Do you want to add something?
I had written back to the question about the research on writing. The question was, can you say more about the research on students who use the keyboard are more likely to engage in revision or to be more productive? So we're happy to locate the exact references for you and send that separately. So even though it has nothing to do with text discussion, it's still a good question. We have a large thunderstorm moving in, so hopefully that won't cause further disruption.
We can try to play the video and see how it goes. Does that sound good, Erin?
Perspectives or people's opinions, we're actually going to look at some photographs. And we're going to ask ourselves, what do we
Aubrey
see?
Wilkes' fifth graders
When
are
we
at the
look at a
beginning of an
photograph,
interdisciplinary
however,
unit, which concludes with every student creating a fictional memoir written from the perspective of a person whose life was affected by slavery. To consider multiple perspectives for their memoirs, her students have been examining a series of primary sources. We captured the class for 4 days in the week prior to starting their research, as they grappled with the complexity of the documents and the topic, finishing with a gallery walk and a Socratic seminar to synthesize their understanding. We've created 2 short videos of the week, beginning with a video focused on primary source texts, as well as this second video, focused on the analysis of photographs and the Socratic seminar.
The day after Little Eva, we looked at 4 different images. And before we started looking at the photos, part of what we talked about was that we've looked at a lot of perspectives. And the question we have to ask ourselves now is, well, then what's true? We've done so much work with text. And the kids are used to saying, in the text it says. But for some reason, they look at a photo and say, he's feeling mad. I can see it on his face. And so we needed to spend a little time on that in class and actually name it. There are going to be 2 things that we're going to be doing. We're going to be looking for facts, what is absolutely true. We're also going to need to make some inferences about what might be true.
After a focus-guided practice, using one of the photographs sharpens students' abilities to differentiate between facts and inferences, Aubrey gave her students the majority of class time to analyze the collection of primary sources.
And I see people holding on posters. I see children. Yeah, they sit right there.
When we look at photos and when we look at primary sources, there's a lot of engagement.
Lady and a white baby holding their she's holding the baby. It looks like they're taking a picture.
The answers aren't given to me. I get to actually make that meaning myself.
We put these 2 pictures together.
And I get to be a detective, and I get to agree or disagree, and I get to look at something and feel smart.
Well, we can't say he's yawning because we don't know if it's true. I think it's an inference because it might just be somebody else's hand going up
You just spent a lot of time looking at these photos, and we can see the facts. The fact is he's a black man. He's a white man. He has a gun. Part of what we did at the end of class then was to look at all of the inferences that we made and then ask ourselves, well, what don't I know yet? What do I need to find out? And some of you looked at that picture of the whipped slave and you just said, wow, I think he probably ran away. And so you turned those inferences into questions and you said, well, did he run away? Why did they do this to him? We might not be able to find out who that man was in the picture. But could we find out why slaves got whipped?
Yes.
Could we find out what the consequence was if you ran away?
Yes.
We could research, and we went ahead and wrote down all of our questions and then decided which ones can we actually research, and we jotted those on sticky notes and we stuck it on that chart. And we're going to bring those back next week as we start researching for our perspectives. On the day of the Socratic seminar, we started with the gallery walk and put up all of the images and the text that we wanted to put music in the background, and Library of Congress has a great resource, field songs sung by actual slaves after they were freed. And it was, one, an excellent primary source, and two, really set the tone for the gallery walk itself. One of the things that happened was what I had thought was a Civil War photo from the time of slavery was actually a photograph from 1908. And so it was a nice chance to put up something surprising on the wall. And actually we were able to have a conversation about when we really do the digging, that inference was wrong. Even though it was a pretty good guess, it was actually not right. We are going to transition now into Socratic seminar. What I'd like for you to do before we start is just take one look at your goal for Socratic seminar.
My goal is to support my ideas with evidence. Also want to build on the ideas of others.
We ended the week with a Socratic seminar, which was a chance for kids to really synthesize everything. So the first question I'm going to ask you to think about today is, how do you think slave owners viewed themselves? They had looked at so many sources and they had talked about so many things and they'd asked so many questions, and it was a chance for them to bring all those sources back in.
That the masters carry themselves is that I'm superior, I'm stronger than everybody else, I can take control.
What words coming up, say what you think George Fitzhugh would say.
Since I'll give you the clothes and you live under my roof, then I'll give you the money, I feed you.
He would say something like, you guys are already free. Every time when you're done working, you're free. They're thinking themselves as a good person because what they do for these slaves and how they treat them. But if you're coming from a slave perspective, you wouldn't think of that like that. George Fitzhugh and little Eva actually connects.
When working with primary sources and complex texts, it's really important to set the kids up for success, and that doesn't mean that we don't let them grapple.
If you're reading all these books when you're young, then you're going to think when you grow up and you get your own slaves that it's okay to do what you're doing because of what the books are saying.
It means that we think about the sequencing of the text, how it's framed, when it will be framed. Can you tell me what you think Frederick Douglass's perspective would be of this book?
I think his perspective will be what you see in books is not always true, because
that we think about the organizers that we use that will make the most sense, that meet the target, and then charting the ideas so that we get a chance for synthesis and a chance to make it visible so that the grappling and that the complexity doesn't feel overwhelming, it feels exciting and doable.
I think that he would say that he disagrees because slavery is bad. With the evidence.
I think I got evidence for you. Slaves have no heart to feel, no soul to aspire, and no head to think.
We're going to switch gears, and inner circle is silent. I'm going to ask.
And so one of the things we wanted to point out before we take a look at any comments that you put in the box is the idea that when this video clip ended, what the teacher was transitioning to is she was inviting the outer circle to give the inner circle feedback on not necessarily the content of their discussion, but the flow of their discussion. Did they support their ideas with evidence? Did they draw their perspectives from the text sources that they'd been analyzing? And so really thinking about, we set these goals for ourselves and our discussion before the discussion, and now we want to reflect and give some feedback to one another about how did this discussion go? Do we think it was effective? How could we improve next time? Let's see. Do you want to add anything, Anne-Marie, or do we have any comments in the chat box?
I haven't seen any new comments in the
Okay.
chat box. I know that we're starting to lose
Okay.
participants because of the time, I suspect.
Yes, it is 5 o'clock. Teresa just noticed in the comment that the teacher used such open-ended
Yes.
moves to encourage that higher order thinking and glean that from her students.
One of the features of Socratic dialogue or these Socratic seminars is that it's not a debate, it really is a discussion so that we can all help one another come to a deeper understanding. So I think you see evidence of the way that she supports that kind of conversation.
Well, with that, that's a perfect summary of how you've been able to lead us through kind of imagining the integration of many of these practices today. And there's one more question. I'll allow you to decide if you want to answer that right now as you're thinking, but I just want to, on behalf of the task force, MAISA, our colleagues, Laurel and Lisa from Michigan Department of Education, we just want to thank you, Dr. Palanzar and Dr. Fitzgerald, for your leadership with us as we continue to imagine how work can be integrated and meaningful for our students in Michigan. And we thank everyone who is involved today in the chat and in some really thoughtful questioning here around this work, because that's the kind of way that we want to move forward. We want to be processing together and imagining together and considering different meaningful moves for our own students. So we just thank you so much for this work and for helping us really see some things that we can grapple with. May 7th is our next webinar. It is at 4 o'clock again, and the link will be sent out again as a reminder to all participants and all facilitators. Do feel free to share that, but May 7th, we will see you again. Final comments, Miranda, Anne-Marie?
I think we'll close by saying thank you so much for these questions and for being here with us today and engaging in this learning with us. It's really exciting for us. We see the 3 more new questions that have been posted. One is about what we suggest for finding engaging free articles for use and discussion with striving 4th and 5th grade readers. Actually, the resource that the teacher mentioned in the video, the Library of Congress, has a variety of primary source texts, many of which would be appropriate for 4th and 5th grade readers, even striving readers. And there are a lot of other resources too that we can send some supplemental information. Erin, maybe post somewhere to provide information for people. And we can also, Anne-Marie and I can also look into some additional information on Socratic seminars for students and how to support young students to engage in that kind of work to the extent that that's helpful. And we're looking forward to seeing everyone again in May.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. With that, we will conclude.
Thank you, Erin. Thanks for managing all of this.